Professor Fuerst, Professor Shimizu, and Mr. Yoda, Mr. Ni. So we would like to have a discussion on carbon neutral housing and buildings. So earlier on, as Mr. Yoda mentioned, Moxion. So the wood will be contained in the building. No, I mean carbon, CO2 will be contained in the building, and I think that can be recognized as that. And Professor Franz talked about embodied carbon. From embodied carbon perspective, do you think that we should be building more wooden buildings from that perspective?
Sorry, was this a question for me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So yes, and thank you very much for the fascinating presentations. I think increasingly what we're seeing is that wood and wooden structures really have a big role to play in the transition to net zero. And as I said in my presentation, we need to first and foremost deal with the existing stock because the city of tomorrow is already built, and to a large extent, the buildings that we're going to have in 2030 and 2050 already exist today. But that said, there is a role for new construction, and I think wood is definitely a material that is to be considered there. I'm aware, and as you are, of the challenges, and that some people have challenged the notion that wood is truly to be considered a renewable building material. But I think there is some evidence, and I'm by no means an expert on wooden buildings, wooden skyscrapers, and so forth. But I think the promise of wood as a building material is a big one, and one to be really considered seriously.
Well, as was mentioned just now, there are existing buildings available, and we need to work on the refurbishment of the existing stocks, which I think is going to be the massive challenge because, for example, people may say that we can dismantle what is available and build new ones, but we are going to end up facing lots of the emission of the CO2 while constructing these new buildings. Therefore, what matters is that we need to work on the refurbishment of the existing stocks. And there are the many housings that are being owned by someone, and refurbishing of these detached housings are going to be quite important. Therefore, my next question is for Yoda-san. Well, in relation to the refurbishment in order to improve the energy efficiency for the wooden buildings, is that going to be very much difficult? Well, I believe that to raise the heat efficiency is going to be quite important in the conventional buildings. Those were very bad, therefore we need to improve that. For example, for that, we need to have the double window structure, and we need to enhance the insulation inside the wall, and same goes for the floor as well. Also, the roof, we have to think about the heat insulation in the roof structure, which I think would be the biggest challenge. Furthermore, well, if it is very difficult to raise efficiency, we have to think about using the natural energy. Well, for example, we might want to put the solar panel on top of the roof. I think that's one idea that we can go for. But for example, depending on the structure of the roof, if you put on the panel, the rooftop is going to have more weight. Therefore, you have to reinforce, or else you would not be able to withstand the earthquakes. Those are the difficulties in relation to renovation. Cost-wise, I think it can be a huge issue as well. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. In terms of technical development, or I'm sure there are various measures that will be required in order to spread this idea. And there's a very important issue related to conventional existing buildings as well. We understand that, but in the interest of time, we'd like to move on to the next topic. And I have another question to Mr. Yoda. Moxion rent, compared to the market price in the surrounding areas, is the rent at Moxion higher? And if it is the difference, as Professor Shimizu mentioned about the increase in energy efficiency, if the rent is higher, what will be the cause of the higher rent? If the rent is higher. Now, Inagi Moxion, the rent is higher than the surrounding RC condos. And 2 years have passed since it's been built, and there are some vacancies. However, even if we raise the rent, people are still selecting these units. So this is being recognized quite highly. Now, until now, one of the reasons why wooden houses didn't spread that much was because the common sense within the real estate industry was that they would not be able to earn rent. But we challenged that. Even with wood, if we have the product specifications, if we can provide something to the market that will be selected by consumers, we felt that the rent initially, it was very challenging. It was higher compared to the surrounding areas. And I think it was mentioned whether we can challenge that. Well, that is what we did. We set the rent higher. But the reason we were able to do so is because this was our own building. If it's for other owners or maybe the duration until it is commercialized and the duration to lease up, they will not be able to raise their rent that much. But in any case, what I want to say is it is environmentally friendly. It's not our unit was selected because of that, because our performance was meeting the needs of our consumers. So if we are able to do that, then even with wooden buildings, we are able to charge higher rent even compared to RC and steel buildings. And this is something that we challenged in the real estate market.
Thank you very much, Professor Shimizu. I think you mentioned that the energy efficiency is the only thing that we currently see. And as was being explained by Yoda-san just now, the business that builds these buildings would have to be sound, or else they would not be able to charge the good rents. I think that's the current situation. If that's the case, what about the rest of the housings that are available? I think the majority of the housings and buildings would not be relevant to this. So for the green label to have a meaning, for example, just like the regulation available in London, what matters is the carbon pricing and the regulation. For example, for the housings with the less carbon efficiency, we may want to think about charging the carbon tax to charge the tax against the bad performing housing. Such regulation would have to be implemented clearly in a clear way, or the green label may not be meaningful. What is your take, Shimizu-san?
Thank you very much for your question. So if you look at the current market environment, it is very difficult to see the value in that, but the market looks at what the design is. So maybe regulating, making stricter regulations, or maybe impose higher tax on the poor performance buildings. So using the market mechanism, I think you will all agree to, but with the current market structure, we don't see a premium. So we need to come up with a market. So how to design the market so that there will be premium. So maybe, as you mentioned, maybe impose burden or impose taxes on poor performance buildings, and also for good performance to provide incentive, not subsidy, but provide incentives. And the old buildings, there is going to be increasing stock, as Mr. Nee mentioned earlier on. So going forward, carbon emission. What is the time horizon that we think of carbon emission? We need to think of that in terms of creating a market, because the wooden buildings, the carbon burden, when it's dismantled, is going to be much smaller. And if we maintain the high burden buildings, because if we start saying that when we dismantle that, the burden will be higher, we remain the surrounding area will remain high burden. So we need to replace those buildings. Maybe we cannot achieve that in 10 years, but maybe if we look at 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, how are we going to control the carbon emission? We need to come up with such a design because the liabilities that we have a lot of old buildings and there's huge environmental burden. We can't just maintain these as is. Because if we do so, the design of the market going forward will change. And as Professor Kurahashi, I think that is linked to what Professor Kurahashi just mentioned.
On the other hand, Dr. Franz, we have a question to you. Well, in London, well, according to your explanation, the one with the lower grade, we saw the significant difference in terms of the rent. But if there is no such regulation, do you think that we would have ended up seeing the gap or the difference in the rent? So maybe we shall see that as this as a result of the regulation. What is your take on this?
Yes, excellent question. And as always, in science and with these studies, working out the counterfactual, so what would have been the case otherwise is a very difficult one. But let me just say for this specific question, I think there is no doubt. If we look at the breadth of the entire evidence across countries with and without the regulation, we see that there is such a thing as a green premium in the real estate market. So it doesn't necessarily take regulation for this premium to appear. It is simply a matter of operational savings, energy savings, lower costs for utility, for electricity, heating, that find their way into prices and rents. They are simply capitalized with or without the regulation. I think part of what we observe is simply due to those factors. And then on top of that, and in addition to that, we see a part of this differential that is due to regulation. And the regulation also played a role there, as we can see when we trace those buildings over time. As the date of the implementation of the policy approached, that discount became more pronounced. So when it was first announced, it was just, a possibility on the horizon. And then gradually over this several stages of the legislation, it became clear, oh, this is actually becoming a reality. And then when it became a reality, that additional discount manifested itself. So I think, there are two components. Would it have appeared otherwise? I think a part of the discount would have appeared, but not the full extent. So I think that's the role of regulation, that it can bring about change more quickly, both in terms of what is already implemented, but also the prospect of future regulation, I think, can play a role for markets in terms of internalizing externalities, pricing carbon emissions accordingly, and doing so even before the regulation comes into effect. But there always needs to be the prospect of regulation. I can't see a role for how this would entirely be market-based without any regulatory intervention on the horizon.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. And also, there's another question that I would like to ask you, Professor Franz. So let's say there is low efficiency buildings will fade out from the market gradually. And you mentioned that the tenants there, you talked about fuel poverty. So in terms of income, they're not all that wealthy, the tenants who are living there. So these people, if the existing buildings are banned going forward, then what would happen to them? That was a question I had.
Yes, and it's also a question that is very much on the forefront of the UK government. What if we just cut out that section or segment of the market that is not just the least energy efficient, but also the one that is the most affordable. So are we making rents more unaffordable? As you know, London in particular and large parts of the UK have an affordability problem anyway. So is this policy, and this was the concern, is this policy making rents even more unaffordable? And is it punishing the low-income households disproportionately? And that is a legitimate concern, I think. But what we've shown is, first of all, the policy hasn't really contributed to the market shrinking overall. And from what we've seen, although rents have suffered for the F&G segment, there are two clear trends that I would name here. Well, the first is if you upgrade a building, then you also make it more affordable for the tenants because the energy bills will be lower. And that is already a big savings estimate because at the moment, a large percentage of these of people's income, of poor people's income, goes towards just covering the pure basics of having a warm home, affording electricity, affording heating. So to the extent that our regulation addresses these concerns, we're lowering the bills and alleviating fuel poverty. At least that is the aspiration. And then secondly, if we could find a way to share the cost burden between more or less the three parties. So you have the landlords, you have the tenants, and then you have kind of government subsidies or incentives. If the cost of upgrading the stock could be shared and distributed equally and fairly among those three, I think we can actually address this concern. So in some cases, for example, where you have really low income households, it needs to be clear that they are not able to carry the burden of the capital cost of upgrading. It needs to be borne by the landlords, the building owners, and possibly with a subsidy or some kind of government grant with it. But I think, it is definitely a concern that we need to keep track of.
Well, thank you very much. Next question is directed to Director Ni. Listening to discussions being held up until now, it seems that for the market to function well, we need to have the regulation at the same time. For example, in London or say in the UK, for the building space at the bad energy efficiency, the regulation is being applied. What about in case of Japan? Of course, for example, the loan being provided from the public institution, for that, the benefit can be enjoyed for the buildings with better efficiency. But for example, in terms of the taxation and so on, for example, maybe for the one with lower efficiency, we shall implement the measures. So in terms of the taxation and so on, so that the paradigm shift would happen, so that the cost is going to be higher for maintaining those buildings. What do you think about this? As you said, for the promotion of the ESG within the market, it is important that it is reflected onto the market price. A system is available. Therefore, as a professor just mentioned, for example, by application of the regulations or with the carbon taxation, we shall do this. I think that's one possibility. But on the other hand, in regards to this matter, in general, what we understand that this is kind of things that would have to be worked on. But when we take a look at each national public, I think we cannot say that we have been able to build a consensus. So in that sense, for the realization of the policy, there is a huge issue. When we want to reduce the carbon carbon dioxide. How much in relation to how much we would be able to reduce? For example, the large corporation will be able to do so, but what about SMEs or the general public? I think additional costs would be necessary, and there is no know-how for reduction of carbon. That's the reality. I think so. What you mentioned is one option, but we still have not been able to build a full consensus. I think it's going to be a bit difficult in Japan, and I think this is the largest challenge that we face. And we are the one who needs to find the right solution for that. But at this moment, we haven't been able to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we had a very good discussion, and we talked about the future direction and also what can be thought of. Now, thank you all very much for your participation. So with this, we would like to conclude today's discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
So with this, we would like to close session 1 of Dokkyo International Forum, Carbon Neutral Housing, Building and Cities. Thank you very much.